Hello, people of the internet, it's Amanda, and I honestly feel like I mentioned this in my past videos where I said I wouldn't be making a comparison video, but after a couple of months of me, just basically missing the Japanese version a lot for very obvious reasons, I decided to rewatch the Korean version last night, and I know just a lot of things sort of like happened, and it led us to this thing today. Now, the thing of this is that it's no secret that if you've seen the other videos here on my channel, then you would know that I adore Miman Keisatsu Midnight Runner, which is a Japanese adaptation of Midnight Runners, the original Korean version starring Park Seo-joon and Kang Haneul. And I jumped into that one because I'm a fan of Hirano show, plays Ichino Sejiro, who is the counterpart of Park Seo-joon's character in the Korean version. And then there's also Nakajima Kento, who is the counterpart of Kang Han-yeol in the other version as well. So this tie-up, I mean, for J-dramas and just J-idols in general, it's sort of like a big deal that this happened, and that's why there's like some sort of like hype that went into the Japanese version of the drama. But I've seen the Korean version, I think, years back. I couldn't remember when exactly, but I've been seeing it on TV as well, especially during the run of Miman, I guess, in the dub version in my own native language. And so, but one of those things where I watch Korean dramas, obviously, but if it's not my cup of tea or it's just not the niche that I'm particularly interested about, so I just sort of like, zone out in the middle of watching it and not really absorb everything about it. So that's what Midnight Runners was for me. I mean, I've seen it a couple of times, but I've never really paid much attention to it. I only know like a couple of details here and there and use that as sort of like a reference during the time that I was watching Miman Keisatsu. Now, Miman Keisatsu, on the other hand, is something that I really spent time on. Like, ever since they announced it, ever since the first episode came out, I did an entire recap of the series every week as new episodes came out. And so it led us to this particular video today, which is me comparing the Korean version versus the Japanese version. It's worth noting that the Korean version is just a movie, so its runtime is 1 hour and 49 minutes according to my research. And then for Miman Keisatsu, it's a 10-episode Japanese drama. So that in itself, one glaring difference in terms of treatment. Miman only covered the plot of the entire movie in the first 3 episodes, and then there are a bit more of like extensions in terms of the narrative for Miman, given the pilot episode had its own arc, its own case. Obviously, this video is gonna have a lot of my own biases, given that number one, I'm really more of a J-drama fan. Number two, I absolutely adore Jirokai and Kento show and just that entire thing. And there's definitely a lot of like glaring differences that I would want to point out between the two. But I'll try as much as possible to still inject a little bit of objectivity. Really can't promise it because, as my parents mentioned while I was writing my notes last night when we were watching the Korean version together, I definitely have my biases over the Japanese version, so there's that. First things first, in terms of just the timeline itself, Miman Keisatsu more or less just followed a very linear pattern. Like, for example, it really just started off with them as rookies, and then there's their first couple of months within the academy. Whereas for Midnight Runners, the Korean version, it really followed more on their beginning, and then we have a time skip of like 2 years, and we immediately jump into the idea that they're already really close friends as police academy students. So that in itself, like, there's already a lapse in terms of the time frame. I have to say that the beginning of it, in terms of characterization. So Joon is the counterpart of Jiro, and then Hyul is the counterpart of Hon Makai. And the thing with this is I noticed right off the bat that most of the character lines of both Kijun and Hyul is meshed into just Kai's character in the Japanese version. Like some of his nuances, like for example, not wanting to like get his hair cut short, or like for example, that one thing in narrative about, it's definitely like they meshed Kijun and Hyul together into the character of Kai. And also like the power dynamic between the Korean version, like the two mains for the Korean version, they balance each other off in a way that they're somehow similar. Whereas for the Japanese version, there's definitely a glaring difference between the personalities of Jiro and Kai. So I couldn't pinpoint exactly like which one would viewers like better. It's just that for me, it was better established in the Japanese version that Kai's character, or Hyul's character, is definitely the brainy one in between the duo. I feel like, they have their quirkiness in a way, but at the same time, like Kai was really made to be someone who has the brain skills, if you get what I mean, and Jiro is really more of just the muscle of the operations. Whereas for the Korean version, it's really more balanced between the two of them. Kijun wasn't made out to be just a dum-dum who's strong. So but another thing that was made distinct in the Japanese version is that Kai is really more of like a straightforward, like cold personality in a way. Like it's hard for him to read emotions, whereas Jiro is really more of that like human side of him. So definitely, again, glaring differences in terms of the personalities. So there's that. Now, another thing that I noticed was that the beginning of how they became friends is also kind of different. So for the Korean version, it was really more of like Kijun didn't really want to help out Hyul in the beginning, like when he injured himself during the run in the mountain. It was really more of like him bribing Kijun so that he would help him out. Whereas for Miman Keisatsu, it was shown that Jiro is really glaringly kind, and that's why he helped out Kai. So again, it really played off with how Jiro is as a character. Like it showed that, I feel like in the Japanese version, it gave more weight in terms of them, what do you call this? Like in terms of them getting away with the situation, because it was really more of out of kindness that Jiro helped out, and that they missed their mark in terms of the deadline, as compared to like the Korean version, where it started off as sort of like this thing where it was really more of a do this for me rather than a favor that was willingly given. So that's also one thing that I noticed. There's really now in the Korean version, there's also not a lot of like room for a backstory for the two characters, which is understandable given the time frame that we're looking at. It's a movie versus a drama. However, I did notice that in the first episode of Miman Keisatsu, they were able to sort of like inject a little bit of like who Jiro and Kai was prior to the academy. And so I only wish that in the Korean version they have done that as well, because I feel like other than the fact as to how they interact with their parents or anything like that, we really just jumped right into like who Hyul and Kijun are in the academy itself, and not really anything about them prior. I do feel like for Jiro and Kai as well, like, and it's pretty typical for like Japanese dramas where a certain backstory adds a little bit more layer to the characters, and so I like that as well. There's also, and if we were just to base it on just the narrative of the first 3 episodes of Miman, so that it would be a fair comparison to the Korean version, it's roughly around like 45 minutes per episode. So that's like 2 hours and 25 minutes in terms of that span. And then this one is a 1 hour and 49 minute mark for the movie. But even so, like those 3 episodes, if we remove like the first case from it, I feel like they still built a sort of like a solid case, even with the side characters into the story as compared to like the Korean version. And again, this may be my bias talking, but I feel like even the part where one of their classmates is a single mom, and like having that little detail right there, while Jiro was waiting for Kai in the cleaning service area while they were investigating, as compared to, you know, the other thing with the Korean version where it's basically like Ki-jun, you know, eating some instant noodles in a convenience store or something like that. But I feel like, again, and definitely because the Japanese version is definitely the, what they call this, like an improved version already, because it's 2020, and I think this one, the Korean version went out, I don't know, 2016, 2017, so they definitely have more room to improve upon it. And I'm absolutely liking how the improvement was like for the Japanese version. The way that they do the gutoppa in the Japanese version, I like how they change it up a bit, because in the Korean version it's really more of like a fist bump. So those kinds of things, like they really try to make it their own in a way, not just complete copy. But I absolutely love that there are still some similarities or glaring references to the old one and the new one in terms of narrative. Now, one thing that I want to point out is even the nature of the case for the 2 versions are quite different as well, but both glaringly important. Like for example, for Japanese version, it's human trafficking, and then it's for the Korean version, it's the legal harvesting of egg cells for IVF. Version definitely gave, not just did a copy of each other, but rather, you know, put or highlighted 2 different situations or cases that are definitely relevant. Point to highlight that these things actually happen is kind of cool. Like if anyone's been curious about how the Korean or Japanese version is like, they're still going to get a similar treatment in terms of how the narrative went, but at the same time, you know, 2 different cases that speak a little bit of like a harsh truth as to whatever is happening. So I like that definitely. I feel like there's just something about like I don't know, like there's still a lot of things to say in terms of, you know, the treatment and everything like that, but I feel like, you know, the Korean version is definitely a lot more polished in terms of how serious it is. Like definitely there's a little bit more of like a realism or a vibe to it that, you know, it's really more for, if you want a movie, if you want something to enjoy that is pretty straightforward, then definitely like the Korean movie has that. This version, obviously, it has its own ingenuities in it as well. So if I were to sort of like summarize basically my thoughts on it, and the thing with this is that I have people who are very much into K-drama, and so they've, but the thing is, like when I forced them into watching the Japanese version first, and then they got curious about the Korean version, started watching it, they said that, you know, once you go with Miman Keisatsu first, the Korean version is sort of like pales in comparison already, because the Japanese version is definitely like, there's a certain quirkiness to it, a certain charm to the chemistry of Nakajima, Kento, and Hirano show there that's really hard to like pull out from the narrative itself. Like their chemistry is definitely a lot stronger in my opinion as compared to Park Seo-joon and Kang Haneul. And definitely I feel like my biases are talking in this one, but I don't know, like if you watch the Japanese version first, I feel like you're also gonna feel the same thing. Like it's gonna be a different experience already if you watch the Korean version after it. However, I do feel like if you watch the Korean version first and then you watch the Japanese version, then you might be able to enjoy both versions more. So I think that's my solid take on it, because honestly I really had friends who are very much into Korean dramas more, who are huge fans of either Kang Haneul or Park Seo-joon, but then because they got to watch Miman Keisatsu first, like they really had certain opinions about Midnight Runners as a version already, like after when they got to watch it. So I feel like it should be like the Japanese version first versus the Korean version first, rather than it be the other way around. so that it can be an enjoyable experience. I'm not really saying that, you know, the Korean version is bad or anything like that, but it's really more of how you want the treatment to be like or something like that. I definitely feel like the Japanese version improved a lot on the narrative, like whether or not we're just talking about, you know, given that it's a drama, obviously it would have more room to sort of like add more elements or layers to the characters in the story, but just focusing on the first 3 episodes alone, I honestly feel like they definitely made it distinct in a way, especially with the characters of Jiro and Kai and how they are like as personalities as compared to like the Korean version. So I like how it's not just a complete copy, it improved on the original material, and at the same time, like the original material has its own thing as well. So yeah, obviously I'm very much biased with the Japanese version, but the Korean version is still very much enjoyable. And if you're a fan of either of the actors, both of the actors in the Korean version, I feel like you're definitely going to enjoy it still. And I do highly recommend the Japanese version if you happen to like this one. So yeah, so with that said, as always, you know, this is as vague as it can go. Like, it's not as detailed in terms of like comparing it from one frame to another, really not like that here on my channel. But even so, I hope that you still enjoy this video. Your thoughts about either of the versions or both versions or whatever down in the comments below. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you're new to my channel and you would want to hear more from me, please hit subscribe. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope to see you again soon in a new one.